I've been playing outdoors since I was a kid, standing by the front door at around 2 years old, hollering, side, 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 trying to get my mom to let me go play outside. Now, after 30 plus years working in the outdoor business, I'm dropping insider conversations every week with the brand leaders, guides, marketers, CEOs, and others to make the outdoor industry a trillion-dollar juggernaut that drives product innovation, revenue, and public policy for everything outdoors. I'm Rick Sayes. Welcome to the Outdoor Biz Podcast.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode 450 of the Outdoor Biz Podcast, brought to you this week by Thrive Market. Think organic groceries are too expensive? So does Thrive Market. Get 30% off your first order and a free gift when you join. Go to ricksayes.com/Thrive Market and get your membership today. I had the opportunity to meet Jonathan Chester on a mountain travel SOBEC trip to Antarctica years ago when I was with Eagle Creek. Jonathan has been a professional photographer and author for over 40 years. He has shot on all 7 continents and specializes in documenting the wild, remote, and extreme, and is equally at home in urban and rural settings covering nature, landscapes, and environmental themes. He continues to guide and lecture on adventure cruises in the Arctic and Antarctic. Welcome to the show, Jonathan.
Thank you.
This is going to be a fun conversation. It's great to catch up after all these years. I was trying to do the numbers the other day, and I can't quite figure out when I was exactly down there. But it had to be in the 80s or 90s, because I was in Eagle Creek until about 91, I think. And we did a lot of stuff with SOBEC, and you guys had a space on the Moltanovsky, and just was one of those fabulous trips of my life that I'll never forget, you know, with you and all the cool experiences down there. And so why don't we start with, what was your first outdoor adventure?
Well, I grew up in Adelaide in South Australia, which is a long way away from where I'm living now in Kansas City. And I grew up in the Adelaide Hills, and there was lots of what we call bush around our houses and homes. And my introduction to the outdoors was really as a kid roaming the bush with some friends from the street and really enjoying the sort of nature in a very sort of unstructured way. But then the family traditions were to become a Boy Scout and a Senior Scout, and eventually what we call a Queen Scout, which today is, I guess, in American parlance, an Eagle Scout. And so I really fostered a lot of my interest in the outdoors, or was able to channel it through the Scouts at the beginning. And our summers were always spent by the sea at a place called Encounter Bay. And so my earliest outdoor aspirations were to be a scuba diver.
Oh, really?
And I had this real love of the ocean and the underwater world. And, you know, my early heroes were people like Jacques Cousteau and Hans Haas, and watched Lloyd Bridges and Sea Hunt and all those things growing up.
Right.
And when I got to university, I had an underwater club. And of course, you know, scuba equipment even today is pretty expensive. And so as an impoverished student, you can't really afford much. But the club had money from the Sports Association and a lot of equipment. And so I was able to learn and become a very, very competent and experienced scuba diver over the 3 or 4 years of my undergraduate degree in geography. And so much so that we started to work for some of these scientists in the oceanography school, helping to deploy current meters. And one of them went off and joined a private company doing environmental consulting. And so my first job out of college was as a scuba diver. And when you're wearing a wetsuit 5 or 6 days of the week, you want something different on the weekends. And I was very keen on, you know, something that was equally engaging and challenging. And an old school friend did a bit of rock climbing. And so I persuaded him to take me out and discovered rock climbing. And I guess Australia is better known for its rock climbing than its mountains. You have to go to New Zealand to find decent alpine climbing. But the rock climbing in Australia was incredible. And so I sort of graduated from being a scuba diver to a climber, and went from going down to going up. And to me, rock climbing became such a sort of passion that everything else went by the wayside. And I spent the next 30 or 40 years traveling, or 20 or 30 years traveling and climbing around the world. And so
well, I didn't know that.
It was a sort of second career in some ways.
Yeah.
And of course, you know, Australia is well known for its surfing culture.
Right.
less so the climbing culture. And so being a so-called climbing bum in Australia, you didn't really have a sort of strong community. There was a few of us scattered around the country that lived to climb. And some of the keen climbers who had a real job were teachers, and they had lots of holidays. And so, one of them had a car, and we would pile into the car and drive basically, 1,000 miles in a week, going to the East Coast and picking off all the climbing spots from the Blue Mountains to the Warrumbungles in Victoria, Mount Buffalo, and Frog Buttress, and just do this amazing sort of drive all night, sleep a little bit, climb all day, and then drive on to the next crag. Those heady sort of
climbers around the world, they all did that.
Yeah, adrenaline driven and youthful exuberance. And, to me, climbing was sort of like nature's heroin. You could just get so entranced and so sort of excited and engaged with it that it was all consuming. And of course, mostly you're competing with yourself in those days. The sort of open competition in climbing didn't come till later. But from rock climbing, I graduated to mountaineering, wanting to be a mountaineer.
And did you do any big mountains?
Well, I took it gradually. There's a whole sort of swath of Australians who used to go to New Zealand at every midsummer around Christmas and go to Mount Cook. And we had no real snow and ice experience. And so many of us took courses, which I did with one of New Zealand's sort of premier alpine guides, Jeff White. And we got onto a little peak down in the south near Aspiring, and we just got hammered by this storm.
Oh, wow.
And I remember sort of helping carry another guy who'd almost passed out and trying to put up tents in, 60 knot winds and so forth. But, the end result was I learned far more from not climbing the mountain and dealing with those conditions than I would have if it had been blue sky. And I think that the notion that, you learn by your mistakes, well, I was with someone who had the experience to know how to handle those conditions. And that was good. So valuable that it stood me in good stead for the rest of my career, more or less. And,
I was going to say, you always learn more from getting into hairy situations and trouble than you do when everything goes smoothly. When everything goes smoothly, it's too easy, right?
Aphorism that, good judgment is the product of experience, but experience quite often is a lot of bad judgment and a lot of sort of uncomfortable or difficult circumstances.
Exactly.
But I managed to get so involved in climbing then that I decided that I didn't have a career as a geographer or an academic, and took basically an 18-month, 2-year trip around the world and flew to England, did some rock climbing there with some expatriate Australians, went to Norway, climbed a little bit there, and then parted with a buddy and hitchhiked with a huge pack full of alpine climbing gear to Chamonix, and lived in the Snell's Field above Chamonix with an sort of ragtag group of Brits and people from all over the world, a few other Australians. And that's where I met, again, one of Australia's foremost mountaineers, Greg Mortimer, and managed to survive the first season in the Alps. A lot of people go there with big aspirations, but my aspiration was only just to come home. In that you can very easily stick your neck out too far. And
so how'd you get to Antarctica?
Well, mountaineering obsessed me for the next sort of quite a few years. And I was actually I had by this stage decided that I couldn't imagine going back to a regular job. There wasn't just enough time in my life to work at a regular job. And I was teaching rock climbing in a partnership with a Scottish mountaineer who was a compatriot of Tom Patey, one of the early Scottish pioneers. And he started a climbing store in Adelaide, and we ran this little business called Mountain Adventure, took kids cross-country skiing in Victoria. And I remember digging a snow cave with these school kids, and I had this sort of epiphany that I was actually being paid to do this. And that was a huge sort of realization that I could make a living at this sort of game. But I knew from my diving experience that if you if you turn what you love as a passion into a job, sometimes it can take away the spice of the passion.
Becomes
And
work. Exactly. Yeah.
yeah, and I didn't want to become a full-time mountain guide. I knew that the mountains were so potentially dangerous. I was flat out making sure and looking after myself rather than taking the responsibility of other people. And, if it's an adventure for the guide, it's potentially a disaster for the client.
Right.
And
They're scared to
so
death. Yeah.
I sort of made a pact with myself that I didn't want to become a mountain guide. And I looked at, well, how else can I keep traveling and climbing and making a living? And I went on a small expedition to South America, to the White Mountains, Wandoi and Alpamayo in 1978, and teamed up with an Australian who was living in England who called himself a photojournalist. And I didn't really know what that was, but I saw what he did, and I thought, hey, maybe that's a way that I can eke out some sort of living and keep doing what I'm doing. And so I spent the next 35 years basically going down that road. And, I had a camera as a kid, but I wasn't a sort of passionate photographer. I was a passionate outdoors person who decided that storytelling and photography was a way to more or less justify my existence. And, you're always your parents' worst nightmare when you're doing things like mountaineering and going on expeditions.
Right.
But just to get back to how I got to Antarctica, I was actually climbing Denali with an American friend, and we were trying to do a story for National Geographic, but they said the story idea was so good they were going to send their own person to do the story, and so we went anyway. And on the slopes of Denali, I received a message or picked up my mail when I got back down that had an invitation to go to a mountain called Big Ben on Heard Island in the middle of the South Indian Ocean.
Oh, cool.
And this is, in fact, Australia's highest mountain, 9,005 feet high, and it's an active volcano. And it's so remote that very rarely visited. And to my knowledge, it's only had, less than a half a dozen ascents. But a team of mountaineers in Sydney had contacted an old colleague of mine, a mentor called Warwick Deacock, who had organised an Annapurna expedition I'd been on, which was disastrous. Number of people killed in avalanche. But Warwick mentioned me to these young Sydney adventurers and climbers as a person who could add some sort of push to their climbing team. And whilst this island is outside of the Antarctic proper, in that it's north of 60 degrees, which is one definition of Antarctica, it's within what we call the biological boundary of Antarctica, which is the Antarctic polar front, where the cold southern water meets the warmer northern water. And so, technically speaking, as far as the ecology of the place was concerned, it was Antarctic, and the weather was the most brutal that I've ever come across.
Wow,
and we managed to make the second ascent of this mountain, and we had sailed there on a maxi racing yacht, which was my first sort of blue water sailing experience. And it scared the hell out of me because
that must have been pretty wild.
It was a 90-foot maxi racing yacht with a 90-foot mainmast. And the thing is that we were sailing into the prevailing westerlies, heading from Australia sort of towards South Africa. And then we got to about where Heard Island was and then turned south because, it's just very hard going against the weather and the wind.
Right.
And our our yacht would sort of climb up these waves and then crash down, and the thing shook and shuddered so much.
Jeez,
I felt it was going to shake itself apart.
Right.
But, we got to the mountain and climbed it. And on the way home, we were going with the wind and weather. And we were on one tack, more or less, for 2 weeks, surfing down waves at 18 knots, trying to hold this ship from pitch poling some of the most exciting sailing you can imagine. And this team of people who were really very excited by what we'd been able to accomplish as a team started to look around for what next we could do. And we came up with the idea of going to Antarctica by yacht to Commonwealth Bay, which is due south of Australia, where Sir Douglas Mawson, Australia's most famous Antarctic explorer, had an expedition from 1911 to 1914. And there were huts still there that had rarely been visited. And so we crafted this idea of an expedition to go and look at the huts and try and help with the conservation of them, and it was called Project Blizzard. And so I ended up going to Antarctica twice in the successive seasons of 84, 85 and 1985, 86, sailing there on both times and spending the summer working on this hut conservation program. And that really was the sort of high point or the real first experience of Antarctica proper.
Gotcha. And then how did you connect with Mountain Travel SOBEC? I guess it was SOBEC back then.
Well, it's a slightly long story, but following on from that Project Blizzard, I was commissioned to be because I was the team photographer, I had also got a contract to write a book about the expedition. And I worked very hard on this book project. And rather than just a sort of swashbuckling sailing adventure story, the editor and publisher decided that I should incorporate some history. And so I ended up writing the complete history of Australia's involvement in the Antarctic and combining it with the story of these two sailing trips to Commonwealth Bay. And I worked very closely with a very talented editor. And the book came out, and it was sort of the first book I'd ever worked on, very exciting. And it went on to win prizes and highly regarded. And I ended up marrying my editor.
Oh, wow. Okay.
The book was called Going to Extremes. And even today, it's still it's a bit of a doorstopper. It's been out of print for a long time. But
I'm sure I have that book. Yeah.
It's a collector's item. But the thing is that my wife and I kept climbing and traveling. But my wife is this book publisher, who wanted to spread her wings, and she applied for a job in California, or was headhunted for a job running 10-speed press in California. And it took us a year or two to get the visas necessary. We moved to California. And by this stage, I'd been to Antarctica a half a dozen times and done a lot of photography. And so I was looking for a way to market my photography. And of course, Mountain Travel SOBEC was just down the road from where I was living. And so I knocked on their doors.
Gotcha.
And met the Antarctic team there, headed up by two people, Chuck and Lynn Cross. And they said, well, actually, we've got a lot of photos, but, what else do you do? And I said, well, I've been here, been there. And they said, would you like to try your hand at guiding on the peninsula? And I thought, well, I'll give it a try. And so they gave me a free trip with my wife at the start, just to see how I liked it and learn the ropes. And that was on the Molchanov, one of those 50-passenger vessels that was the mainstay of Antarctic tourism in those days in 95. And I loved it, and spent the next 6 or 7 years being expedition guide and then eventually expedition leader for Mountain Travel on these small ship cruises to Antarctica. And they were the sort of halcyon days of adventure travel, where the ships were pretty basic by today's standards, but it was a wonderful experience, as you well know.
It was a great experience. At my time down there was fantastic. I thought the ship had everything you needed. I mean, it was kind of, it wasn't a luxury cruise ship, but I don't think those existed then. But still, it was everything you needed. So when did you start Extreme Images then? At that point in time, too?
I had been, ever since 1978, I had been working away at trying to market my photos from these adventures. And, I realized pretty early on that the photographs on their own were good, but they were usually part of a bigger story, and that I needed to write a story that the photographs illustrated. And so I became a sort of person selling packages of story and word, or photos and words. And one of my early successes was to actually get a story about one of the Annapurna expeditions I did in Australian Penthouse, of all things. And of course, they actually paid reasonably well in those days. And so that was a sort of tick along. And so I was getting lots of magazine articles published, and I couldn't quite work out what my brand was. I had an idea that I was going to call myself Mountain and Polar Images.
Yeah. But
eventually, by the time I got married, my wife said, look, you need something a bit more punchy. Why don't you call yourself Extreme Images? So I have to thank my wife for a pretty sort of compelling name. Yeah. And of course, she comes up with book titles all the time that, help books walk off the shelves. And that's why she had called the book that I wrote about Project Blizzard Going to Extremes. And so it all fitted there nicely.
That's a good partner.
And so extreme images became it. And I learned that one of the great things to do is to do presentations, slideshows, and had quite a career traveling around Australia. Every expedition or adventure usually resulted in a slideshow tour. Sometimes, in one case, after the Annapurna expedition, which was somewhat of a tragedy, I had to do a sort of memorial to the people who passed away.
Right.
And that's really when I learned about the power of what we call multi-image back there, where you had sort of 2 Kodak slide projectors and a dissolve unit, and you faded back and forth. And compared to today's PowerPoint and keynote presentations, it was very primitive, but we were breaking new ground, and we had music as well. And so that power of performance and power of storytelling gave me a whole new view of my life. And I just wasn't a climbing bum and a photographer anymore. I was a storyteller and a sort of visual storyteller, if you like.
Yeah. So how do you approach capturing the beauty of nature and the exciting part of nature? Do you have a vision before you go, or does the scene strike you? Do you have a storyline that you line out? How does that happen?
One of the reasons why I decided to stick to stills photography back in those days rather than become a cinematographer was that making movies in those days always involved a sort of camera team on top of the adventure or expedition party. And so there was always this, feeling that you were having to stage things or do take 2 and take 3.
Yep.
And I always wanted to be part of the adventure, not be a bystander looking on. And so, my attitude always was you had to get it at the time. You couldn't ask or ever sort of slow down the progress of whatever it was happening. And so that meant that you had to pre-visualize. You saw a scene or a setting, and you thought, well, if this person walks into the scene from there, that could be a great shot. So you have to, ski ahead or hang back or basically be sort of situationally aware so that you're constantly pre-visualizing what the image might be. And of course, that involves, being fit enough to be fast if you need to be fast, and not be afraid of being slow and ending up in camp a half an hour after everyone else because you were getting shots while they were all skiing on.
And you weren't necessarily staging those. You were letting the adventure happen and photographing.
Yeah, totally. Letting the adventure,
like that.
Not even just participating in the adventure.
Yeah.
And there's lots of decisive moments. So you always had your camera at the ready, which meant that there was a lot of wear and tear on the gear. So you always had to have backups. And in those days, mostly the early adventures were all shot on film. Yep. And so carrying film stock, cold was the biggest problem because film would become brittle and you'd have to wind on very carefully. No motor drives or anything extraneous like that. It was all very basic. And my early cameras were like an FM1, and I still have an FM2, which I just loaned to my son, who's become a retro photographer shooting film in Europe at the moment. But interestingly, the more basic the equipment, the simpler the gear, the better it was, and rarely had anything longer than a 200 millimeter lens. Wasn't into wildlife photography at the very beginning. And of course, lightweight was important, robustness, and, good quality optics. And so, the main gear in those days was either Olympus or Canon or Nikon. And I started down the Nikon road and have been very satisfied with that sort of progress of their gear and that ever since.
What kind of gear did you have to protect it from the elements?
Well, I used to have...
Stick it in your jacket?
Yeah, I used to make sort of covers out of neoprene before they were available commercially. And you could get these arrangements that sort of gave you some protection. I used to use a Nikonis underwater camera on some of the sailing type ventures. But the ceiling on the cameras was pretty good. A light shower you could survive. And I remember once when we were climbing Big Ben, we were abseiling down off this very, very cruddy sort of volcanic little cliff, and there was a big rock that started to dislodge, and I managed to hold it in place with my feet, and I was sort of on abseil, and so I was worried that if the rock went down, it would hit the rope that was curled up on the ground below me. And so I was holding the blade with one hand and pulling up the rope with my other and holding it in my teeth, and I finally got all the rope up, But as I was doing this, I brushed my camera, and the lens was not seated properly, and so the lens just rotated out of the camera and then went spiraling down and crashed into the ground at the bottom of the cliff. And so, that was a sort of heart-stopping moment. Anyway, I had to let the boulder go, and it crashed down. And then I abseiled down and got to the bottom, and there was the lens sitting in a sort of little heap of cinders. Picked up the lens, brushed it off, put it back on the camera, and it didn't miss a beat. It didn't take any damage.
Yeah.
And so, you can be lucky. Having strong, good gear is half the battle.
Yeah, you got to have good gear. That's right, yeah. What role does technology play in modern outdoor photography, do you think? How do you leverage it? Or how do you use it? It's amazing how different it is.
Today's modern outdoor photographer has to be a pretty versatile shooter. The incredible advances I see in the last, 10 years, the mirrorless cameras that have become so small and lightweight relative to our SLRs, and the advent of drones and the GoPro style cameras. I mean, GoPro, I think, revolutionized adventure photography.
Yeah.
Mostly for filmmaking, but, stills as well. Mm-hmm. And the fact that you could have, 2 or 3 GoPros and document and make a film about your adventure as you're doing it without having an external camera crew. And so many great productions now involve that sort of setup. That technology has made adventure photography very real. You can capture such exciting and dramatic activities in real time that it's a wonderful thing that has happened to shooters who love to do things and document them.
Do you do anything with phones now, iPhones?
My iPhone is actually my main camera on a lot of occasions, so it behooves you to have enough storage there and a top of the line where, you've got a good range of lenses and you can do so much with them. You can shoot in ProRes, you can do, amazing video. The video on my phone is fantastic. I love the time-lapse features, the panoramas, the slow-mo, all that. And it's almost like you need several iPhones when you're doing these things sometimes, because if you set a camera up with doing a time-lapse as you're sailing down a fjord or something, that means you don't have a phone to do other things. And so that's where the GoPro can also come in handy, because a couple of those as part of your kit makes it very, very able to get lots of different angles and different styles of photography, whether it be, POV, a head-mounted or chest-mounted camera.
Yeah.
And then, different sorts of mounts that I love to use, a little sort of tripod head with a magnet that you can stick on anything metal.
Yeah. And
the robustness of these things is pretty good, although I still use a housing when I'm ever putting it underwater, and just sticking on the end of a sort of long selfie stick to get seals or whales underneath the Zodiac. Can get some amazing stuff that way too.
When they're so small too, like you say, you can carry 3 or 4 GoPros and 3 or 4 iPhones and do a lot with it, as opposed to the old days.
Well, the big
carrying that kind of stuff in the old days would have been
powered up.
100 pounds, 200 pounds. It's crazy.
Yeah.
But then you got to power them. Right?
Keeping, having like ways to have remote battery packs or access to charging through solar panels and things like that, especially if you're really remote, is part of the challenge. We used to have sort of lithium battery packs when I was doing some of my early adventure stuff that you could use. They were sort of one-time use, but they held a hell of a charge, and you could charge your phone or your camera off those a number of times before they ran dry. But the technology now, especially with drones, has made adventure travel. And I mean, my brother's a landscape photographer on Kangaroo Island, and he basically uses his drone as a sort of aerial tripod. And so he's not so much interested in sort of sweeping, panning shots and the video, but taking a dozen shots of a sort of landscape from high up and stitching them together in a way that you wouldn't be able to do effectively with a helicopter or any other sort of means. It's a whole new area of the way to see the world, which is fantastic.
Yeah.
Think organic groceries are too expensive? So does Thrive Market. They guarantee savings on healthy groceries and home essentials delivered. How? It's easy. They work directly with the best organic brands, so you get the highest quality products without the big retail markups. Shop everything from pantry essentials to sustainable meat and food to non-toxic cleaning supplies. And get 30% off your first order and a free gift when you join Thrive Market. Go to ricksays.com/thrivemarket and get your membership today. That's ricksays.com/thrivemarket. Now back to the show.
So sustainability and conservation are increasingly important topics in the outdoor industry. How do you ensure that your practices align with the environmental stewardship principles? I'm sure there's...
Well, we're very guilty of being people who have a higher than normal carbon footprint.
Hard not
mostly
to.
because of the travel we do. That is the sort of the plane flights we take, the ships we go on. I mean, you can be as assiduous in the rest of your life, with electric cars and using bikes and trying to have a sort of a low impact. But the fact is you're using these phones that take an enormous amount of resources and rare minerals and rare earth minerals and things like that to make that there's no escaping all of the carbon costs of the equipment you use and the travel you make. And so it's sort of like either thinking about do I do carbon offsets? The company I'm currently working for, Aurora Expeditions, an Australian-based travel company, has recently become a B Corp, and so they're looking at their whole business practices, from supply chain to how they only use recyclable or reusable water bottles on the ship. No plastic ever is sort of made available on these ships. And so, ensuring that the companies you work with as environmentally responsible as possible, I think, is one of the ways that we as sort of thought leaders in the outdoors, we can make an impact. And I think, we have to give huge credit to Patagonia and Yvon Chouinard for the way that he has led the outdoor industry in its sort of putting their money into very, very important conservation causes and establishing a sort of philosophy and workplace practices that many other companies now see as the way forward in terms of social responsibility.
Yeah, we're getting there. We have a long way to go, but we're getting there. Yeah,
and they established a very good reputation very early on because of all the pioneering research they did in new materials. But now we know that our fiber pile is, as it shreds sort of micro plastics.
Not good, right?
It's we've been guilty a long time for how we use that sort of gear and wash it and so forth. So understanding some of those issues and trying to work around them or change up what we use in the way of materials, I think, especially with the plastics issue, is an important one.
That's a huge one, yeah. What advice would you give to aspiring outdoor photographers looking to make a name for themselves in the industry?
Well, I think, when you get to a reputation and a sort of big enough name, you don't need to be such a specialist. But starting out, the secret, I think, is to whatever the activity is that floats your boat or inspires you, whatever you have a passion for, you need to be a really good practitioner of that activity, which you can then leverage as the person who documents it. And so it's hard to be a rock climbing photographer without being a good rock climber.
Right.
If you want to be a skiing photographer, you need to be able to ski so well you can ski in front and behind.
You got to ski better than everybody else, yeah.
That's right. So you always have to sort of look at these things in tandem and find a niche, whether it's, a particular area of the world, a particular subject matter. One of the things I became very passionate about was wildlife photography, and particularly penguins. And I sort of published about 6 or 8 books on penguins alone, different ways of sort of depicting them. And I wrote the Sierra Club book on penguins because I wanted to learn about penguins. So if you're a wildlife photographer, understanding the biology of the creatures that you want to photograph is enormously important. And then the gear is important, but also the patience and the research that you need to do to find, what's the breeding season, where are the flyways. There's so much more to getting great wildlife photography than just being a good photographer.
Right.
And so I think that photographers, trying to make their way in the outdoor world today, whether it be action or activity-based or landscapes or nature, really dive deep into those particular niches and have personal projects. Do something, you can't always get paid to do something, but quite often you'll get assignments or get work based on the quality of your personal projects or your passion projects. And I think that's something that is important to keep in mind. And those are the ones where you can experiment. You're able to, be your own art director and really chase that different angle, that different aspect that maybe no one else has been able to capture.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Do you, of all the things that you've photographed, do you have a favorite type of photography? Something draw you to animals?
I started my career at university studying geography, and so I do have a real passion for landscapes and the coming together of very, very emotionally powerful lighting with amazing landscapes and scenery. I think is something that really is one of the things that I enjoy most. And finding patterns in nature, finding compositions that really make a powerful photograph. Many people say, oh, you take lots of photographs, but I say, well, actually, I make the photographs. I don't just take them. I think that sort of sense of sometimes making a photograph where there is just a few simple elements, and when we're traveling on ships, and a lot of times you don't have the luxury of being able to sort of spend 3 hours hiking into the right spot. But, with things like zoom lenses, you can crop in the camera. I mean, today with digital, you can do that at all, on the desktop as well.
It's amazing.
But the, technologies today with all sorts of AI enhancements and that for building up small files into bigger files, et cetera, give us sorts of luxuries that we never had, rather than having to have a 40 megapixel image, you can make do with a 20 and upscale it. But I think that landscapes, mostly what I was passionate about, but also adventure where I was part of the action and documenting all of that went on the adventure.
Yeah, that sounds pretty fun. Yeah. Do you have a couple of tips for shooting in challenging or adverse conditions?
Well, I think one of the biggest situations is to be safe yourself and be comfortable enough to be able to work. I mean, if you're frozen and your hands aren't working, they're numb, then it's very hard to think creatively and even work the gear sometimes. So, good personal gear, good levels of fitness, and, well-fitting boots that you're not going to get frozen toes. I mean, there are things like electric socks now. Well, I've never used them, but I know the gloves, to me, the right sort of combination of gloves makes all the difference when you're working in the field with, layering. And those are some of the important things to think about. But then also having various routines with your gear, changing batteries, changing lenses if you have to. And in many cases, that might mean actually having several bodies, because changing lenses in a snowstorm doesn't really work very well. And snow on the sensor or whatever. So having enough gear to be able to do it properly, but not too much gear that's going to get in the way of what you're shooting. And especially if you're doing photography on rappel, everything has to be tied on and not too heavy to impede your sort of mobility. But I think today the gear is getting lighter and lighter, and so it's getting easier in that sense. But people are trying harder and harder things, so that makes it sort of balances it out.
Pushing the envelope all the time. Yeah. What's next for you in Extreme Images? You got any projects coming up? Any places where you're going next?
One of the things that I'm sort of at the stage of my career now where I've had a lot of amazing adventures, and so I'm trying to sort of go back through all of the material that I've had from all of these different adventures and work on sort of a memoir that encapsulates the mountaineering expeditions, the sailing adventures, and to tell some stories, give some new views. And the way we look at the world now is quite different to how we did 30 years ago. And so some of the things that I was involved in today are sort of part of the history of mountaineering in places like Antarctica. And so bringing some of those stories back into currency, lots of things that young people today don't know anything about, how we got to do, sailing trips and climbing trips. Luckily, we did them before so much bureaucracy and rules and regulation made it challenging. And there was a remote factor as well, where we didn't have satellite telephones and everything was done by HF or VHF radios, and you were really out there.
Or nothing
So
sometimes. Yeah.
I think there are lots of things I'd still like to do. There's a few mountains I still like to climb, but having had a family, there's sort of a story. There's old mountaineers and bold mountaineers, but very few old bold mountaineers.
Right.
And I have the luxury of having, used up 14 of my 9 lives, I guess, in different experiences, and so we're very thankful that I survived as long as I have, and want to mentor other people and pass on some of the experiences I've had to inspire others.
Well, you're great at that. I remember going down there, the tips and things that you had, not only about the photography, but the penguins and the boats and how to get in and out of the boats. And it was just fantastic. So you're good at your job, very good at your job. One of the best. Do you have a favorite piece of outdoor gear under $100 that you always have with you?
Well, when I'm, moving around outdoors, I always want to make sure I've got, well hydrated and have some decent gloves. And I like the layering of gloves where you can have these special photographer ones where you can peel off the outer mitt part and your fingers are still exposed.
Yep.
To be able to work the cameras, and then you can quickly snap the mitt part back over your fingertips. That's one of the basic glove combinations that I always use. And likewise, moving around in snow and ice, you don't always want to have lug a tripod, but I found a Mountain Smith trekking pole with a sort of top that you can use as a sort of monopod.
Yep.
Is really helpful for a sort of everything from being a pro lightweight tripod stuck in the snow to helping you up and down the hills with all of your gear. So not even camera gear, but just things that make moving around and staying warm and comfortable, I think, are some of the things that I look at pretty much as vital.
That's really important down there too, yeah. I bet you do a lot of reading on the boat sometimes when you're not editing photos. Do you have a favorite book?
Well, there are traveling. I'm always taking way too many books, especially on these Antarctic trips. And so, a lot of the old expedition narratives, I end up loading up as PDFs on an iBook or something like that, iPad. But, the modern histories of Antarctica that sort of reinterpret some of the places I go to, interesting, especially on the Antarctic Peninsula. And one of the best reading books about the history of the Antarctic Peninsula is called The Storied Ice by Joan Booth, which is thin on photographs, but it really tells the stories of some of the adventures on that part of the world where most adventure travelers go in the Antarctic. A lot of the early work of Frank Hurley and Herbert Ponting, I think as photographers, it behooves you to learn about the gear they took. And there's a wonderful biography of Frank Hurley by a colleague of mine, Alistair McGregor.
That's a great book.
Talks about the trials and tribulations of this man who basically invented travel photography. He was shooting in Papua New Guinea, in Australia. He was the person who captured all of those amazing images from Shackleton's endurance expedition. Mm-hmm. And he started out his career as a postcard photographer in Sydney and then talked his way on to the Australasian Antarctic expedition that Douglas Mawson led. And that's what really established his name. And so, learning about the works of those photographers. And then more recently, one of my sort of people who I looked up to and thought were amazing was Galen Rowell, who came from your neck of the woods part of his life, and he and his wife died tragically in a plane crash. But he was the sort of most accomplished mountaineering writer, photographer of his generation. And I guess I sort of took a leaf out of his book, and that was some of the things that I tried to emulate in my writing and photography, doing really amazing trips and then telling stories about those trips. I think he was one of the people who pioneered that genre.
Yeah, he was a great guy too. I had the good fortune to meet him a couple of times. Great man. And his wife. And how can people reach out and follow up with you if they'd like to?
Well, I do have a website.com. Okay. That is a way for people to follow me. I've also still got some books out there, that they can track down on Amazon, either secondhand or or some of the smaller penguin books are still in print. I did a whole series of books called so-called gift books, and the most popular one was called Flipping Brilliant. And they're called gift books because they're sort of at point of sale, but I was able to find a way to get my photography into a small book that was pigeonholed as like a graduation present, or it had Penguin's Guide to Life, and it was called Flipping Brilliant, and it sold about 80,000 copies. Cool. My biggest selling book ever. The larger photographic books are hard to keep in print, but these small gift books have really done well for me, and I ended up doing a series of them that are still available. One on polar bears called Stay Cool. The last one I did was a book on sort of the arts of being chill, and it was called Zen Penguins. And so nice. I teamed up with a very clever writer, and we did a 4 or 5 of these. That sort of another way that photographers can look at getting their work out into the world. Obviously the web is very important, but there's something very satisfying and important about still getting your work in published books, and they're timeless and something you can really feel proud of doing. And so I encourage people to, either self-publish or try and find a way that you can still publish a photo book. Some very good photographers. A Canadian colleague called Dave Brocher has done some great photo books. And, there's a great new one coming out called The Art of Climbing by an Australian, Simon Carter, that I'm looking forward to getting hold of. But, I think that my early book, Going to Extremes, and then the one that I'm really proud of, which is called Loneliest Mountain, they're collector's items. That was the story of the first ascent of the highest mountain in Victoria Range of North Victoria land of Antarctica, where we sailed there on a tiny yacht. So, there's books that I personally have been involved with that I'm very proud of, but also there's great work out there from some of the leading photographers in the wildlife field, like Frans Lanting and Tom Mangelson, people who have really made important contributions to our understanding of wildlife.
Yeah, there's some great stuff out there. So it's been great talking to you, Jonathan. It's been a long time. I'm glad we were able to catch up.
It has, and it's been wonderful to reconnect with you.
Yeah.
And look forward to staying in touch.
Definitely. And hopefully we'll see each other somewhere at an event. I'm sure it'll happen. There's some event coming.
Looking forward to it.
All right. Thank you.
Hey, before we wrap, I've got a special message for you. I know some of you have a podcast rolling around your brain, or already have a podcast you'd like to polish up a bit. I'm excited to announce that I'm partnering with Tracy DeFord's Stephanie Euler and the Produce Your Podcast team to get it out of your head and into your followers' ears. Tracy and her team have helped me grow and monetize my show, and podcasters trust them because they deliver. Go to ricksays.com/PYP to get all the details. Let's get your show created, produced, and on the air today. Go to ricksays.com/PYP and get all the deets, and let me know if you have any questions.
Thank you for joining us on another episode of the Outdoor Biz Podcast. Be sure to visit our website, theoutdoorbizpodcast.com, where you'll find show notes with links to everything we talked about and more. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts so you don't miss a single episode. And while you're at it, if you found value in this show, we'd appreciate a rating on iTunes. Or spread the word and tell a friend. That would really help us out too. Be sure to tune in every week. And thanks again for listening to the Outdoor Biz Podcast with Rick Says.